I gotta watch myself.
You're gonna be good,
Yes, I
Charlie.
think you have to,
Yeah.
yes, and you have to push them to top.
Oh,
But
some
that
of
one's
the-
on.
Some of the best comments happen about 10 minutes before the meeting starts and a few minutes after it ends.
There we go, okay.
Seems good.
Yes, I think so, I'm just gonna angle this up.
My notebook can cut away.
Actually, I'm better in the audience, you know?
That's what I was thinking too.
And
hell with this.
Get out of here, everybody.
How is somebody's late, Louis?
You go off the side, didn't
I'm not a side person.
you? Side, little sidebar.
Okay. Come to sit with us.
I'll sit with the real people.
Yes.
There you go.
How you been? The technology successfully completed.
Well, actually,
Ours didn't work.
that's a little change.
Yeah, it just for some reason it wasn't connecting, I'm not sure.
Curtailed the creative giving.
The insulation guys stepped on the transformer box, which I had fixed with glass
That I had taken care of.
meeting 2 weeks ago.
My leaf litter thing is falling off.
Exactly. So I actually have quite a few of those.
No,
I'm helping.
You can sit wherever you like, you want to sit up over on the side.
Working for a lady.
That's what it's all about. Hi, Jim. How you doing today?
We're getting there.
Yeah, you're getting there.
Anyone associated with
With the peanut gallery back here.
It's the end of the day.
No, he
He's
didn't want to
getting
sit.
there.
That's right.
He didn't want to sit over on the
Hang
side.
out back here.
That's when I came in and saw Wayne over there, it's like, oh, wait, where do I go?
Thank you for putting it up.
Sorry, you're welcome to come sit with me as long as you can survive
There's
the
a lot
little,
of different.
little trap I've set
Oh,
for
I'm
you.
sure the rest.
How you guys?
Well, this is a
You don't have anybody
concept
sitting
that
next to you.
sticks.
Not that I'm saying so far.
The Pittsburgh City that has super. It's hard to fit this area. Septic field, they need property, well, they do, but you better have a septic field to support it.
Right.
That's the issue.
Or another. So it makes.
Did they have a kid? Did they have a kid?
Could they go to 7 months? Could be.
What's this, Mark?
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Did I hear?
7 months.
Congratulations.
Oh, I'm so happy.
Philadelphia.
You'll
Figure out.
think we go
Yeah.
back now, this way.
Do it myself.
Everything's expensive, so if I got something else.
Are all of yours are now closer, right?
Mine under.
Exactly.
Yours I'm not so sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, so we're gonna live with
When did she go?
brothers and sisters and keep, they get along.
2 years. I'll be going in January.
She likes it though.
She likes, yeah, she likes the work.
You do.
It needs a little more pushing. It needs a
People.
little more pushing. You got a bony butt.
Yeah.
Two?
20 years old, you know, you're not losing.
My three?
You callous.
Mine has twins.
You callous.
Her older sister has 3 kids.
I think Miles always made in my head as like that 6-year-old
That's formal.
Like that's like what, like, I remember probably the last time I saw her, like in my mind, like that's like.
Cleaning up all this stuff, like your father's masters of science
Been a lot of
thesis.
years.
Do you want it? You got it. It's old. His master's thesis.
Why did you have it? And did you?
Well, it was required back then to have a copy. Then
So you found it in
yeah, and right now it's not required to keep copies and it's everything scanned. They digitize it, so it's not very big. They have a bunch of these oldies.
Did you look at it?
Oh, yeah, it's a light,
You're
power
welcome to
lighting.
sit over there or wherever you're more comfortable.
Yeah, I'll get, yeah.
Agree.
Yeah.
John and Wayne are in the back. There is a seat there.
Yeah, absolutely, I thought about it, I put this off the side, but I have a few others like that, of people who are still related or family members still well.
She does look pretty scared. I tried my best. You're telling me, are you still?
Chairman? Yeah.
Will,
Yeah.
you're
Oh,
right.
yeah, I love what I do.
I don't know, Mike.
Long time ago.
He was like the person rec guy.
But there is
He never stopped, he just got.
Engineering, bases removal.
You know, you look at it.
I see your quiz. I know.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, pick that out.
And I'm trying to do it like today was the laboratory.
You're gonna have to.
I'm going to.
I love the lab.
I don't know how to
Watching
do
the
it.
students work.
Yesterday.
Are you still teaching courses?
I teach you, my personal reduce, because it's I enjoy that.
No, you think about
I still have graduate PhD students.
Oh, Mike Seaver. Oh, yeah.
The university sent me, these things.
Council.
Yeah, something's on a lot of different things.
It's 10 years. It's a golden
Parachute thing.
But it's a right. So, this was MJC or Eddie here. Recently sold out.
Such a on your side.
I find that because you had a free
When you're ready.
Does
it keep going?
So then.
They had an old box down to like the bridge crossing there. Box steps, down to that point, that's all like rooted. That's all I could do.
Oh, yeah. Do they continue it still? Or no? Oh, they do.
Okay, I'd like to start our meeting this evening. And just wanted to let everyone know that this meeting is streaming live on YouTube Live in real time. And it's also being recorded for future access by members of the community who couldn't be here tonight. My name is Mark Beliveau. I'm the chair of the Lee Planning Board. And the first thing I'd like to do is just to ask all of the Lee Planning Board members to identify themselves. Again, Mark Beliveau is chair.
David Houston. Nick Binion.
Lou Ann Griswold.
David Cedarholm?
John LaForest.
Wayne Lehman.
Howie Hoff.
Yolanda Cheney.
Okay, thank you. We just have one item on our agenda tonight, and that is to hear from our consultant on their audit of our land use regulations, otherwise known as their regulatory audit. By way of a little background, how we got to where we are tonight, the town of Lee has a housing committee, and as part of that committee's work, they were looking into ways to help diversify our housing stock here in Lee, to provide different forms of housing and to provide more affordable housing opportunities. And as part of that process, they learned of an opportunity to obtain a grant from the state of New Hampshire to help fund that process, essentially. That committee asked the planning board to assist in our kind of land use role, and so we interviewed some consultants that were pre-approved by the state of New Hampshire. We ultimately selected Barrett Planning Group, and what Barrett has done is they have conducted a review of the town of Lee's regulations to try to identify how those regulations impact both positively and negatively the ability to create different forms of housing in Lee, including affordable housing and workforce housing. And with us tonight is Will Downing from Barrett Planning, and he'll be really leading the presentation tonight. and there'll be opportunities for questions. And I will defer to Will when I turn things over to him as to how he wants to manage his presentation and the timing of questions and everything. One last thing I'll mention, the New Hampshire legislature in 2008 adopted legislation that mandated that all communities within the state of New Hampshire provide meaningful, I'm paraphrasing now, meaningful opportunities for affordable housing and workforce housing. And so communities throughout the state, it's actually very broad, have been doing the same thing that Lee is just beginning. And the last thing I need to mention is that we have water and cookies off to the side, and we encourage you to get up at any time and refresh yourself. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Will.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And as I was just introduced, my name is Will Downey. I am a planner with Barrett Planning Group. And over the last couple of months, we have been working with the Housing Committee and the town planner to review the ordinances. And so tonight, I'm going to talk to the public a little bit about what we found, and also hopefully get some input from all of you about what you've seen here today and kind of how things look moving forward. So just to go over what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to start by, Mark's already done a great job, but just a little bit more about what the planning program we're working under is. And then I'm going to do a little bit of review of some of the town demographics for Lee, kind of what the housing stock looks like, what the population looks like, what the incomes look like, just to set the stage for what we're talking about here. And then I want to talk a little bit about some results we had from some targeted interviews that happened a little bit earlier this summer. And then discuss the audit findings, and then hopefully get a little bit of input from all of you. I have a couple of questions that I think will help us kind of round out the things we've already heard, and also kind of help direct how we move forward. So first, about the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant Program. It's part of InvestNH, and it is essentially the way it works is the state provides grants to municipalities to analyze and update the regulations in up to 3 phases. The first would be a needs assessment, a regulatory audit, which is what we're discussing tonight, and then regulatory amendments, essentially taking what we found in the audits, and if the town felt necessary or wanted to move forward, basically addressing what we found in the audit in regulatory changes to the zoning or other forms of regulations like that. So I do just want to stress that I am an independent contractor. I have been hired by the town. I am not a representative of the state of New Hampshire. This is a grant program, and I am being paid through the town. I always like to just state that out front, avoid any confusion. And the goal of this program is to increase housing development opportunities and remove regulatory barriers to increase housing variety, housing choice, and sometimes housing affordability. So more specifically about the work that Lee is doing. Lee has secured funding for phase 2 from the state, preparing a regulatory audit. This audit's job is to understand and identify barriers to housing development and propose remedies. So what we've already done so far is identify barriers to housing creation in the form of the audit, and we've done that through my and my team's review of the town's already existing regulations, as well as some interviews with people familiar with development in Lee, developers, real estate agents, engineers, people like that who can help us understand what it's like working with the town's regulations and zoning. Today, our goal is to discuss our findings with you, the public, and get some of your input on how you react to the findings, and a little bit of how you would like to see us maybe move forward. And so the next steps after today will be finalizing the report and developing recommendations for if the town decides to in the future address some of these recommendations. Talking a little bit about the town's demographics, Lee's population has been growing. In 2021, the town's population was 4,524, and the Stratford Regional Planning Committee estimates that the town's population will increase by another 12% by 2050 to, as you can see here, past 5,000 people by that point. In addition to that, Lee's population is aging. In 2016, so a little bit over 5 years ago from when this data is, the population over the age of 55 in Lee was 28.8% of the total population, and in 2021 it was 37.4%, so that's a fairly significant increase. And this becomes more pronounced the kind of higher up the age scale you go, with now 1 out of every 5 residents in Lee is over the age of 65, and that is a number that has grown by 61% since 2016. So this is a population that's both growing, but it's graying as it's growing, which is a trend that we see throughout New Hampshire and Stratford County, but in Lee it's particularly predominant, it's particularly noticeable. And discussing a little bit about households. In 2021, 28% of households in Lee had children under the age of 18, which is actually a slight decrease from 30% in 2016. So actually there are fewer households with children in Lee now than there were a few years ago. Another interesting change that we've seen in the household makeup in Lee is more households are paying more of their income for housing. As you can see on the bottom chart here, in 2016, 381 households were paying more than 30% of their income, which in planning circles we consider that rent burdened. So these people are paying a significant chunk of their salaries every month into their housing. And so in 2016, that was about 22% of the population. And now in 2021, you see that the number of households that aren't rent burdened has stayed almost the same, but the number of households that are now rent burdened has increased fairly substantially to 524, making up 28% of all households now. So you're actually seeing a growth in the number of households that might be having trouble making their bills. In addition, looking in 2021 specifically, you've seen a large share of the population is actually paying a very significant number out of their income on this. As you can see here, 12% of households in Lee are paying more than 50% of their monthly pre-tax income on housing needs. And so this is both across rental housing and owner-occupied housing. So this is not a phenomenon that is just in one group or the other. In rental housing, you see it's more noticeable. It is actually 36% of all renters in Lee are paying more than 50% of their income. In owner-occupied housing, it's more 26% are paying between 30 and 49% of their income on housing, and an additional 9% are paying more than 50%. And in the same time period, the median household income in Lee has actually fallen slightly to $88,750, which is a 20% decline from 2016. Meanwhile, the percent of households that are below the poverty level in 2021 rose to 2.4%, which doesn't seem like a huge number, but that is a tenfold increase from 2016, when it was less than 0.2% of the total population. And I don't have any answers for why we've seen a decline in the median income. It's possible that due to the number of the increase in elderly population, this could be reflecting at least partially people transitioning to fixed incomes, but we just don't know. The data doesn't have it, but this is an important thing to understand. And discussing workforce housing, we always like to let the community understand what workforce housing means in a particular community. Because workforce housing does not just mean subsidized housing or inclusionary housing. The way New Hampshire defines workforce housing is at its price point. And so in Lee, a workforce housing unit must be affordable to a household making $136,000 a year, which under the definition that is a family of 4 making 100% of the household median family income. So that is for for-sale units. And for rental units, it must be affordable to a household making $73,440. And so at those prices, what a workforce housing unit in Lee means is a house that sells for no more than $407,000 and rents that are no more than $1,800. And so I just think it's important to kind of understand and contextualize what workforce housing means in these communities. And moving on to talking a little bit about Lee's housing supply. Lee's housing supply has increased fairly significantly since 2016, rising 19% to 2,041 units. And the household, I'm sure this isn't a shock to anyone, but the majority of households in Lee are owner-occupied. 87% of all households in the town own and live in their own houses, with a much smaller percentage renting. And in 2023, according to the New Hampshire Realtors Association, the vacancy rate for Stratford County is less than 1% overall. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing, while Lee's housing has increased fairly substantially in the past few years, it is still a very tight housing market with very little on the supply side, essentially. And then discussing housing costs, we heard from all of our interviews that for both owner-occupied and rental properties, housing costs have been rising very quickly in Lee. For 2023 to date, just to help set the scene a little bit, the median sale price in the Portsmouth, Rochester, New Hampshire area, which is the area that Lee falls under, was $435,000. And the median sale price in Lee was $550,000 as of August 2022. This was the most recent data we were able to get because everything lags a little bit. The median rent for a 2-bedroom unit in Stratford County was $1,613. And on top of that, the average utility cost per month in Stratford County was $348. So as you can see, these are fairly significant housing prices, and I always like to think of these as they relate to those workforce housing obligations, where median means the middle. So this means that of that 550, half of all the houses sold were more than that number. And then, so now that we've kind of laid the foundation of what Lee looks like from a data perspective, I want to talk a little bit more on the human side and some of the things that I heard from some of my interviews. As I've already discussed, the people we spoke to were selected by the town's planning staff, and we asked to speak to people who were familiar with the housing situation in the town, development and regulations in the town, basically to help us understand what it's like to interact with these regulations. And we spoke to developers, residents, some members of Lee committees, and professionals involved in both real estate, engineering, and development to help us understand how people that work with these regulations every day interact with them. Because, as anyone here can attest, when you work with something every day, you're going to know it better than anyone else. And so we didn't base our assumptions purely off of what they said, but we used it to influence us based on and kind of understanding with my own review of the documents. And so the two major takeaways we got, the first of which was Lee's housing market. We heard that supply was very low, that it's very hard to find housing for sale or for rent in the town. We heard that it's a very, very competitive market. In these interviews, I heard several times of people that were looking for housing for months, and they would try to put something down, especially on a for sale home. They would try to put something down on a home, and then it would have been taken off the market on a cash buy within a couple of hours of going online. I heard the same thing for rental units. One person I spoke to who's a landlord in town mentioned that they posted an ad for their property at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and by the time they got to work at 8:30, they already had 25, 30 inquiries about it. We also heard that the prices in Lee are high and they are increasing, which, as the data we've already discussed, seems to point to. We also heard that there was a lack of diversity in housing types. We heard several times in these interviews that if you aren't looking for a fairly large single-family home on a fairly large lot, it's very hard to find something in Lee. That is the predominant form of housing. We also heard that there were groups that had unmet needs in the town. Particularly the two groups that came up the most were younger families and younger households who were looking to start their process either in rental units or lower cost, what are usually called starter homes, or I prefer lower cost housing. And seniors who are both looking for lower cost housing as they move to fixed incomes, and they're looking for accessible housing. Housing that is only on one level, so they don't have to worry about stairs. Housing that's actually physically smaller, so they don't have to maintain their 2,000, 3,000 square foot home. And I heard that those were groups that didn't feel like they had a lot of choice in the town. And the final thing I heard was who was coming and who was leaving Lee. And I heard that the biggest groups that are coming in are older households, as the data seems to agree with. And I also heard that families are coming in. I know that the town is very proud of its school system, and that's a major draw for communities. I heard from some other people that a lot of younger households were also leaving, but I heard it both ways. And so that's kind of what I heard about the housing market from people that are familiar with it. People that live here, people that live in this world. And the other thing that I learned about was environmental and infrastructure constraints. And so this was more of what I heard from engineers and developers that work in town. The things that I heard is there are a number of land types in town that are hard to build on. This is especially wetlands, bodies of water. The town has a lot of wetlands. The town has a lot of areas that are unbuildable because of either their slopes or other programs like that, and that makes it hard. I also heard that the town has a lot of permanently preserved conservation land, which in a lot of times is a good thing, but I did hear that this is constraining where there is room for development in the future. I also heard that the lack of public sewer and water is a major challenge for development in the town because you're bound by both New Hampshire regulations on how big lots can be, how much land you need for septic systems. You're bound by how much actual land you need to get a septic system, and septic systems are expensive. Wells are expensive. And especially those three can sometimes combine to make it very hard to find parcels that work in Lee, because you have to find kind of a lot that isn't conserved preservation land, that is not on those soil types that it's very hard to build on. And on top of that, you have to get a lot of it to get sewer and water. And what I also heard from some of these developers was that Lee's regulations are stricter than the state requires. And in some points, they did say that this made it harder for them to develop. And I'm not saying, and I'm saying that in a value neutral way. I just heard that this is something that they talked about. They said that there are certain ways that the state regulates that Lee has chosen to go above and beyond the state minimums. And that with all these other things, it sometimes makes it hard to find plots that they can develop on. And so I think this might be, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you all, so before I jump into the regulatory audit, I just wanted to, if anyone has like factual questions about what we've heard right now, I can take a couple of minutes and then we'll jump into the audit, or if no one has any questions, we can just keep going. Yes?
Not too long ago, the nursing home in town
Mm-hmm.
ceased operation and all the people left.
Okay.
And did you take that into account as you were looking at changes in numbers of old people or that kind of thing? Since that was kind of a step function that occurred once.
I had not known that the nursing home closed. This is the reason I do this type of thing, so thank you for that. I haven't taken into consideration, I'll need to think about it a little bit more. But do you know when the nursing home closed? Was it just off the top of your head?
Last August.
Okay, oh, so this is very new. So this actually wouldn't be in the data that I pulled, because the data we were pulling is from the American Community Survey, which is a form of the census, and that data was from 2021. So if it closed earlier, so if it closed either in 2022 or 2022, then those numbers actually don't reflect that number. So I would actually be I think we might have to wait until the new ACS numbers come out, but I'd be very interested to see what impacts that has on the population in town. And thank you. Yes?
How do you get the number of households that are paying more than some particular fraction of their income for housing?
This is based off of, again, the American Consumer Survey. So this is the U.S. government telling us this is a form of the census. Instead of a 10-year census, they poll shorter periods of time. I don't pretend to understand exactly how they get those numbers, but my understanding is that it's based on the questions they ask. Essentially, they ask people, how much do you pay of your income on this housing, and they take those numbers and conglomerate it. But those numbers are coming from the Census Bureau.
When you look at those percentages, are you also comparing it to New England in general? Because I know all over New England, we're all in this difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just Lee.
No.
In terms of how much people are paying for their housing. I know my kids, they're in their 30s, they make good incomes, and the apartment rentals are crazy.
No, you're absolutely.
And how do you control that?
It is very hard, and that's
Yeah.
that is very hard. And I think there's no one silver bullet that if you just do this, you can fix it. This is, as you said, something that the entire New England region is really facing, and something that the country itself is facing kind of everywhere, but especially in New England, especially Lee is unfortunately kind of caught in that greater Boston housing that, as someone who lives in this area as well, I also understand. And so I think that it's important to understand that context, but it's also, I think that it's also with the numbers as they stand themselves are very important, especially I was very surprised to see the numbers of people that are paying over 50% of their income in housing.
How many people did you interview?
Oh gosh, the number off the top of my head, I believe it was about 8 people for the target interviews. And so I know that sounds like a low number, but
Yeah.
yeah, well, that's why we're doing this form of public engagement now. Because, you know, the nature of the people I needed to talk to were kind of those professionals in those trades. And so it was hard to kind of get those numbers. And we're actually also having a larger survey that we're launching today that will be open to everyone that we're going to be using to kind of balance out that smaller group that I interviewed earlier.
Okay.
All right, if that's everything, I can jump into the audit. And so first, just some important considerations for everyone as we start talking about the audit. The purpose of this audit is to identify what barriers there are to housing creation in Lee. And we are using that as a value neutral term. And what I mean by that is just because something is in this audit doesn't mean that it's something we say needs to be removed. It's just something we want you all to be aware of as a barrier to housing. There are lots of barriers to housing that are very important. A town's sole obligation is not to create housing. You have other important things that it's important to balance, such as conservation land, quality of life, other things like that. And we acknowledge that in this audit. And we do not expect the town to remove entirely or even remove in part everything we found in this audit. The way we encourage this to be viewed is as a way to understand the barriers present in the town and to help identify if there are any areas that want to be modified or eliminated. The way I've been describing this to people is I think of it as when you're building up your budget for the month or the year. When you want to save money, you don't write down only the things you want to get rid of. You write down all the things you're spending money on so that you can take that and go, okay, this is very important to me, I want to maintain that. But now that I see it all out, maybe we can reduce this, or maybe we can address this, or maybe I can get rid of that. So I do encourage everyone, I welcome debate on this and I welcome hearing your comments and feedback on this, but I do just want to say there might be some things in here that people don't agree with, and that is okay, because the obligation of this was to present all the barriers, not just the barriers to be removed. And also just to talk a little bit, to help everyone kind of get in the mindset, I want to talk a little bit about where the areas we're talking about in Lee. So on here, the green is the residential district. That is the only district that you are allowed to build housing in Lee. The smaller ones you see up in that north corner, up by the four corners, that is the commercial zone. And then down further south, that red hatching, that is the light commercial. In both of these districts, you are not allowed to build any residential uses by right. The bluer spots you see there are the Aquifer Conservation District. And what's an important limitation to understand there is you are only allowed to build what the zoning calls low-density residential development, which isn't necessarily defined, which we'll talk about later in the audit. And it caps impervious coverage at 10%, which means if you want to build a 2,000 square foot, oh, thank you very much. Yeah, that's perfect, thank you. Which means if you want to build a 2,000 square foot home, you need a lot size of 200,000 square feet. And that's not including any other impervious surfaces like driveways, paving, decks, other things like that. And then the areas you see that look like they're following the rivers are because they are. Those are the shoreline districts, and those are 100 feet from the shores of all of Lee's major bodies of water. The Lamprey River, the Oyster River, Little River, North River, Dew Brook, Chesley Brook, and Wheelwright Pond. And in these areas, you cannot build any permanent structures, roads, driveways, or parking areas. And finally, the areas that you see that are hatching are the wet soils conservation areas. And those areas are basically where the swamps and the extremely wet soils, the bogs, are in town. And as in the Shoreline Overlay District, you are not allowed to build any permanent structures in those areas. So just so people can understand what we're looking at when we talk, even before we talk about what has already been built out, those areas in green that you see are really the only areas that you can build anything in Lee for housing. And so talking about housing, I wanted to put together a little chart for everyone to see of the types of housing that you're allowed to build in Lee. And so Lee, because it only has the one residential zone, Lee makes its decisions based on what type of development you're building. So what you're seeing here on the columns are the form of development, and these are all individual development types designated by the town's zoning. So these are single-family and two-family dwellings, condominium developments, open space residential developments, multifamily developments, and manufactured home subdivisions. And the rows you see there are what types of housing are allowed to be built where. So if you want to build a condominium, you can build single-family homes, two-family homes, or multifamily homes, but you can't build manufactured housing or ADUs. And if you wanted to build open space residential, you can build single-family, two-family, and ADUs, but you can't build multifamily housing or manufactured. So I always think that it's really important to understand and to actually look and see what types of housing the town is encouraging, just based on look at how many yeses there are. So the town, just based on this, there are lots of different forms of opportunities to build single-family and two-family dwellings, but there are relatively few ways to build multifamily or manufactured. And then bulk standards, and I know this is a little bit technical, but I just wanted to identify these because these are talked about in the audit. What this is essentially how far your setbacks are on your property. How close to your property line can you build a building? And these have a fairly large impact on housing sometimes, because if you allow, say for example in the open space residential, you allow shrinking lot sizes to a smaller amount, you still have to have those setbacks. So that actually limits how small you can make housing. And smaller housing is typically available at a lower price. And then this is the more important one that I want people to understand. This is more bulk requirements, but these are addressing minimum lot sizes and how dense you can build housing in the town. So for single family, you need 2 acres of land to build in Lee. You need 5 acres for a two-family. And for condominium, open space, multifamily, and manufactured homes, you must have a parcel of 20 acres before you can do anything. Even in areas like open space residential, where you can subdivide to individual lots of 30,000 square feet, you have to find a 20 acre parcel first to do that. And then maximum units per acre, this is how many units you can build per acre. You know, if you have, so you're a single family house and you have 2 acres, you can build a half a unit per acre. And especially I want to draw your attention to the condominiums and the multifamily. The densities you're allowed in these types of development that are usually denser than single family housing are actually less dense. You're only allowed to build 1 unit for every 3 acres of land in these types of housing. And then the development buffer areas are for larger scale developments. You must have just an area that you can't put anything in between the property line and where you can start developing. That's 100 feet from every side in those areas. Preserved open space, how much land you have to set aside as stipulated by the zoning for preserved open space. And minimum frontages, how wide the lot is. And so now moving into the actual topics. The way the audit is organized is we have several topics with subtopics, and the first topic is unit density limitations. First, the town has relatively large minimum lot sizes. As we've seen, as you just saw, it's 85,000 square feet to build a single family home in town, and it goes up to 5 acres for two-family dwellings. And then you must have 20 acres for this, for larger scale multifamily developments. And what that does is that, especially in a town that's approaching build out like Lee is, sometimes it's hard to find lots available for those sizes. And this is made even harder because of the next point, which is exclusions for calculating developable land for multifamily development. And this is a little bit complex, and I know this might not make a lot of sense. I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more, but essentially, the way Lee is structured, when you buy a piece of land, that total piece of land is not the amount of land you have to calculate how many units you can put there. You have to subtract any wet soils in the area. You have to subtract any slopes over 15%. You have to subtract any rights of way, so that's any roads, any parking lots from that. and you have to subtract any bodies of water. So you take the parcel of land you bought, and then you subtract all of those lands, which could be fairly significant, and then that's the number you're working with for how many units you can put on that lot for multifamily. So this means that essentially, the one unit for every 3 acres is actually, in many cases, even less dense, because you're subtracting so much land from it. And then the next point is limit of 6 units per building. In Lee, you are not allowed to put more than 6 units in any single building. And what this does is this constrains the way that developers can make projects feasible, because it's expensive to build. I've heard numbers in this area of upwards of $300 per square foot to build. And when you're building multifamily housing, the reason multifamily housing is available at lower prices is because you're able to break that total construction cost out into more units. So you're able to reduce the per unit cost. And when you have a limit like this of 6 units, you're limiting how much they can break apart that cost. And it also, yeah, so essentially it's making it harder to make projects feasible for developers that are working in this area, and it can, in some cases lead to higher prices for the multifamily housing that gets built. Our next major topic is restrictions on multifamily and condominium developments. First, as we've already talked about, is the 3 acre per unit density. This discourages multifamily housing, and instead it encourages single family housing development, which allows actually for a higher density of 1.95 units per acre. So if you're a developer and you're able to get those 20 acres that you need for a multifamily, a lot of times you're incentivizing them to, instead of building just 6 units of multifamily housing, they're going to build single family houses. And because they now have these big lots that the town requires them to build, they're going to build very big single family houses that are going to sell at a higher price. And they're going to be selling for that $550,000 you're seeing. I see your hand, but can I? Yes. Can I?
That's backwards.
What is?
It's 1.95 acres per unit.
Oh, thank you very much. And the next point is single access points. The design guidelines for multifamily units either require or encourage that developments only have one entry onto a public road. This means you have to build the roads wider because you have to account for two-way traffic. And this also sometimes makes it harder for them to find the right siting for a place. Because as you've seen, there's lots of areas in Lee that you can't build on, even with individual sites. And so now you have to build this big road that you can't put on wetlands, that you can't put on steep slopes. And so that makes it harder sometimes for them to actually access if they're doing a subdivision or things like that. And then 50-foot separation between buildings. Lee zoning requires that you have to have 50 feet between buildings in these types of development. And again, that makes it harder to site these facilities. And it makes it harder for them to make these projects feasible. And then the next point is requirements that development cannot lower surrounding property values. And we don't have an objection to that. We understand that property values are an important part of the town. But our point is the zoning ordinance doesn't state what that means. And so you just say it can't lower property values, but it doesn't say whether you have to prove it in any way. It doesn't say how you would go about proving it. You have to commission an entire economic feasibility survey. And so if you have people that are opposed to development in town, this is essentially, the town is essentially leaving itself open to people essentially just ruling out multifamily housing because they disagree with it on a purpose. Next is limits on alternative housing development methods. First is only allowing attached ADUs. This limits the type of ADUs that can be created, and it can also require major renovations to existing homes, which disincentivizes some people from they would otherwise want ADUs on their properties, either for, you have an aging parent that doesn't want their big house anymore, so they want to move into an ADU and have their kids move into the bigger house, or they are or they're a household that's struggling with affordability and they want to bring in a renter to help supplement their mortgage costs. And by not allowing detached ADUs, you're making it harder for them to do that. Additionally, the lack of clarity on ADU requirements. The town doesn't have an ADU ordinance, it simply says that they are allowed and that they must be attached. And if there are increased clarity on these, it will A, encourage more people to do ADUs now that they know what they have to do, and it can also help both the boards understand what they're approving, and it can help give the town some control over what the development looks like and how it acts. And then deep setbacks in cluster developments. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but as everyone saw in the minimum lot sizes chart, the cluster residential development allows you to buy a 20-acre parcel of land and then cluster all the housing in one section on smaller lots, with the idea that then the land that you saved, with the difference between that 30,000 and 85,000, is then preserved as open space. But the problem is the current ordinance doesn't fully lower the setbacks. So that means, yeah, you can reduce your lot size to 30,000 square feet, but you still have to have 50 feet between the curb and your house. You still have to have 25 on each side. So that limits, can you actually build a house that people are going to want to buy on 30,000 square feet when you have to have 50, when you're losing 50 feet from the side and 50 feet deep. And finally, the town has a transfer of development rights. And the way transfer of development rights usually work is you have a parcel that you want to preserve for open space. You can sell the rights to develop that parcel to someone else, and in exchange, say you know, they want to build an extra unit on their property. You can sell your right to develop those units, and they can buy it and build it on their property. But the problem with the way Lee's is organized is you have to be contiguous lots. So the lots have to be touching. And the problem with this is it doesn't actually encourage density in areas where it makes the most sense. Because, you know, say you picked an area that you want to have development in the future. Well, you know, these people all want to preserve their open space, so they can make money by selling their development rights to other people who can build denser development in the places where it makes the most sense. And if those aren't contiguous, you can't do that under the Lee zoning ordinance. And so there's really no benefit to this unless it doesn't encourage density, and it's very hard to do because unless you can get one of your direct neighbors to sell to you, it's never being used. And then the environmental overlays. The first is the lack of clarity on allowed development in the Aquifer Conservation District. The exact way the zoning is written, it says only low-density residential development is allowed, but it doesn't stipulate what that means. Does that only mean single-family housing? Does that mean two-family housing? Does that mean you can't build multifamily? Does that mean you can only build 3 units? The zoning ordinance doesn't say. And when you have confusion like that, that makes it harder for boards to make their decisions, and it makes it harder for developers to understand the requirements that they're walking into. And also large buffer areas for the shoreline conservation zone. As we've already discussed, this is 100 feet from all major lakes, rivers, and streams, and you can't build development of any kind there. You can't build permanent structures, and you can't put roads or parking, which sometimes can be difficult because if you have one of these bodies near the front of your lot, and the best land for development is past the river, you can't build near the river to get to the place you want to build. And finally, prevention of disturbance and environmental overlays. This is kind of similar to what I just talked about in the Shoreline Conservation District. If you have a wetland on your property, not only can you not build permanent structures, which makes sense, those are dangerous areas, but you can't run roads to it, which raises the same issue of if you're built on a slope and your house is near the back of your lot. What do you do if there's a wetland coming forward? You can't build a driveway or a road to your house. Or if you're a developer and you've gotten your 20 acres parcel, but the problem is there's a wetland by the major highway. You can't build a road to get to your subdivision. And so that makes it, and so this is another way that the town's ordinances are making it harder to build with the limited amount of land that Lee has. And in some other towns, what they do is they have these types of requirements. What they do is they allow either as a variance or a special exception to build certain types of roads or other things like that if you can prove that it's necessary for the development of the lot. And then finally is administrative processes. The first is lack of timeline for required impact studies. The site plan review regulations allow the planning board to request various studies to help support their rulings at any time, which is great. It's very important to have these types of reports that you need so they can make your decisions. But you only have, under New Hampshire state law, 65 days to make your determination. And because you don't say when you have to request these studies by, it's possible for someone to ask for them on the 64th day. And either the planning board has to vote in a day, or, that's an over-exaggeration, that's hyperbole on my part, but it would be allowed. You have to either vote without the amount of information that you need to make your decisions, or you have to push the process back. You have to seek and develop and negotiate with the developer an extension, and so that's delaying the processes, and that's more money the developers have to pay on their loans. That's more money they have tied up in these projects. And a lot of these loans are varying rates, and especially right now, every day you wait, those rates keep going up. And so just having some extra clarity on that will help both the planning board to make sure that they prioritize getting the studies that they need, and it also helps the developers understand what's going to be asked of them. And then lack of uniformity in determining buildable areas. The town has several ways to calculate buildable land. We discussed a rough estimation of that before, but depending on the type of development you want, there are slightly different ways. Sometimes those rules we discussed earlier only kick in if it's over 25% of the total land that's not developable. Sometimes it's, if you have a foot of wetlands on your property, you subtract a foot of wetlands. Sometimes you have to subtract rights-of-way. Sometimes you don't have to subtract rights-of-way. Sometimes the way the zoning is written, you have to take 10% out as a rule for rights-of-way, and then you have to go and take out the actual amount of the right-of-way again. And so this causes extra confusion, and it makes it harder for people to understand the development in Lee, both for the people that are approving these projects and for people that are trying to understand them as an outsider trying to build. And every mistake they make, I'm sure the planning board can relate. You have to ask them to come back, so that's another couple of weeks they have to wait. That's more time for those loans of building interest. And it just adds more time to the process when it's confusing. And finally is ease of use. There are a number of places in Lee's regulations that appear to contradict each other or create confusion about the actual requirements. And so one example that I pulled of this is in the condominium development ordinance. Specifically at section C1, it says that the maximum unit density is altered only if more than 25% of the total land is unbuildable. But then, a couple of paragraphs down at C10, it says rights of way are subtracted from the total lot area before calculating density. So this is within the same, this is not even within the same ordinance, this is within the same article. And so which one do you do? Do you subtract it? Do you not subtract it? Do you only subtract it if it comprises more than 25%? And so again, these are just things that raise questions, and when you raise questions, you're adding time, you're adding confusion. You're making developers' jobs harder, you're making the planning board's job harder, you're making the zoning board's job harder. And so that is the end of the audit that we've talked about. I know there's a lot of things we have. My next step is I want to get some input from the community going forward, but if people have any questions about the audit, I would love to talk about it for a few minutes. I know that was a lot of information thrown at you, so if you want me to go in more detail on anything, I'm happy to. Please, I know it was a lot. Yeah. Yes.
You, in the environmental overlays, you said that in Lee, they do not allow development in those areas, shoreland, wetland. And that's correct, that's what it says in the regulations. However, you said in many towns, they allow for variances for development in those areas. And that is the case in Lee also. But you didn't indicate that. I'm on the Conservation Commission. In fact, right now, in the next 2 weeks, we have 3 requests for variances, 2 for Wetzel's Conservation Zone, 1 for shoreline. So it is not uncommon to have variances for various developments, various components, so it's not there's not a prohibition on it.
No, thank you. And I must admit, please forgive me. It's been a long day for me. I misspoke. Of course, you can seek variances for most things in all towns in New Hampshire if you have zoning. So what I meant to say was special use permits or special exceptions, which are less regulatorily burdensome than seeking a variance. Because just so everyone knows, under New Hampshire law, to receive a variance, one of several requirements is you have to demonstrate that the variance is not because of economic hardship. So what that means is if you're reasoning for, I need to build a road in here because it will save me significant money rather than looping all the way around my property, that is not, you can't get accepted for a variance under that. And so special use permits and special exceptions are a little, because that's not a requirement for those, they're a little bit, it makes it a little bit simpler for people that really need to. And a lot of times our point in this is identifying barriers, and a lot of those are financial barriers.
And Will, I would just add as a follow-up to that, so a lot of these provisions that Will and his team have cited are located in the zoning ordinance. And virtually every provision in the zoning ordinance, an applicant can seek a variance from that, right? And they have to plead their case to make special circumstances. So what the Barrett Group or Will and his team were trying to do here is really just, on the first blush, what does the regulatory environment in Lee look like?
Mm-hmm.
Often you can get exceptions to them, but developers, when they're assessing, what community do they want to go into in order to build their project, they look at the ordinances and they make they make an informed judgment. They say, wow, if I build this project in, town number 1, I don't need to go get variances at all. I can go straight to the planning board. More efficient, I'll spend less money, and so forth. In town number 2, which is highly regulated, they say, gee, I'm going to need to go to the zoning board and I need to get relief from 5 provisions of the zoning ordinance. So a developer will say, well, I'm going to go to town number 1 just because it's less burdensome and I can get things done quicker there. So the objective here, the point that you make is an excellent one, a very important point to understand, but it's really just in the first instance, what are the not permanent barriers, but in the first instance, they're barriers.
No, that's an excellent point. Thank you very much. And I should have said this up front, but everything I've talked about is by right. Because as Mark just talked about, by right is when you start making things not by right, you're increasing, again, the things we've talked about, the development times, the application processes. If you have to go and seek a special exception or a special use permit, you have to appear before multiple boards, so you're doubling the amount of boards you have to appear before. You're doubling the amount of applications you have to submit. And so while these aren't things that rule out development, it's again, you are making it more likely that someone who's looking to build a project will go somewhere else.
I see how we have to look at our regulations and probably change them in some ways, but there's no regulation about how much profit a developer can make. So they can come in and put in these projects, and in 10 years, when I see a condominium on Lafayette Road in Portsmouth for $500,000, how is this providing workforce housing?
No, and that's an excellent point. There isn't much, unfortunately, one of the problems that towns have is you can't control construction costs, especially. You can't really control what profit margin developers have, which is an absolute point. And that is a barrier, but sometimes what towns can do is you can change how much land is tied into those values, and you can change what types of housing you're encouraging. And right now, Lee is encouraging large single-family homes on big plots of land. And you're making it hard to build other forms of housing that can be sold at lower values. So I'm not saying that any of these will single-handedly resolve any of these issues. But right now, overall, Lee's ordinances are making it very hard to produce if you had someone that was inclined to produce those lower cost forms of housing that are seen. And Lee is in fact encouraging the kind of quintessentially large, single family that sell for, in the higher end of the income market, on these big lots. And those are things that the town can control.
That's if we vote on it, right?
Yes, yes, yeah, any
Have
zoning
to
amendments
be-
have to go to town meeting.
Right, I just had another question. Can you tell me what the difference is between a single family and an open space residential development?
It's just the scale. So a single family house is, it would just be one house on one lot.
Okay,
And the open space residential is what you asked, yes?
yeah,
Yes, so
because you
that
had two
is,
different, you had a single and then you had the open space residential on
It's
two
lot
different
size.
columns.
yeah, it's
So
lot,
what's the difference?
so it's lot sizes and it's also the scale. So if you want to build that open space residential development, you can't just build one house on 30,000 square feet. You have to buy, or you have to find 20 acres and then subdivide that land into,
It's like Daniels, right?
yeah, into the total development. So you can't, so a single family house, you could just find 2 acres of land, build a house.
Right,
You can't, the open space residential can't be divided like that. If you want to build an open space residential development, you can't buy just 2 acres and put a single house on it. You have to find or acquire 20 acres first and then subdivide it. But
And
the
then-
but the types of housing you can build on them are similar.
Right, and then there's, like James Farm is open space, it's got conservation land, reduced lot size, and then a bunch of land is left open in open space.
like Riverside.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly, yep.
Yeah, and the big incentive behind open space residential is they give you, essentially, it's the open space. You get you get smaller lot sizes in exchange for that. The difference between what you built on and what is reserved is kept permanently preserved.
Did you take into consideration the master plan of the town of Lee?
A
And how's it related to all this?
a little bit. That's gonna be, I'm focusing on that more as we go forward into the recommendations, and that will influence it. Right now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to read through the town's existing regulations and see how those are working, but I was influenced by the master plan.
Okay, thank
If you look at, only having been through my own subdivision, I was just curious if you looked at, you know, talked about septic costs and things. I know that was one regulation that I ran into that was, you know, Lee has a higher, you know, required test pit to go to 5 feet versus the 4 feet.
Mhm.
And I can get 4 feet everywhere on all the 10 acres. It was hitting that 5 foot. Was that something that came up at all in any conversations?
Could you say that one more time, please? I
So
think I
the,
missed it.
so a test pit requirement.
Oh, yeah, okay.
For septic, in the state,
Mhm.
the minimum is 4 feet.
Mhm.
Lee, our standard's 5. Like, I didn't know if that kind of regulations were the kind of things.
That was in our building regs.
Yeah, so like, just things like that, like, you know.
Yeah, these
Because you talk about septic, I just didn't know, would you get
No,
that
of
kind of
course.
detail when you're looking at things for recommendations? Is that where like the level of, like, if you were to change this, you know, you talked about septic costs and things like that, is that, those are the kind of things? And like then looking at environmental impacts and what that might change based on the change?
Yeah, and this is, I don't believe that particular one, because I didn't look at the building regs, I was looking at subdivision and site plan review. But those are great examples when I talked about basically, this is a great example of how Lee's regulations go above and beyond the state minimum.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
that was the only one I could think of. I
No.
didn't know if there was other one, you know.
No, and thank
so
you,
far
that's an excellent
like one of the
point.
ones, 'cause talk about septic costs being a high,
Yeah.
you know, use, and to me, that was, you know, obviously there's, could be environmental impacts of having less, you know,
Mhm.
leaching and things like that, but, you know, so obviously there's more to it than just one thing, but, you know, with statement was one thing,
Mhm.
but, you know, if there's other ones you'd come across, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, yeah, and the report, so this is kind of, what I just went over is a more kind of 30,000 square foot for everything,
Yeah.
and I go more in
Detail,
detail in the
okay.
actual report. But if there are no other questions, do people mind if I ask you some questions? All right. So, how I was hoping this could go is I have a couple of whiteboards up here, and I have some questions for everyone that I hope will kind of spark some debate, and I'm gonna write things down soon. Hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation. So, my first question is, was there anything you heard today that surprised you?
The no children household percentage. especially, I'm a real estate agent, I have so many people that wanna live in Oyster River because of the school system. And to find out that there's not a whole lot of homes in Lee itself, which is only one of the 3 towns that don't have children.
Yeah, thank you. I know that was something that I heard. There was a lot of, I heard a lot about, you know, how Lee is very attractive to families and families or groups coming in. So I was surprised to see that it would actually decline.
I was surprised at how much people spend on their household, like houses, like, you know, compared to overall income. I think that was more shocking of a number than I expected financially.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? I think I saw, yes?
I think some of the, when you were doing some of the figures, the fact that it was 3 acres as opposed to 2 acres for some of the multi-units, I think they were condos, but just
Yeah.
that it makes it harder to provide more housing in
Yeah.
a small area. You'd think it would go other way around, sort of like the open space area, but it seems counterintuitive.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's for condominiums and multifamily housing, which are all the ways you can build more than 2 units in a structure.
Right.
Anyone else? Yes?
If somebody was looking into buying or building senior housing or affordable housing for
Mhm.
seniors, they would have to be a very good grant writer.
Yes. Yes, and I didn't mention this at the time, but the reason I gave you all the figure of over 55 is that's usually when you qualify for senior housing. Anyone else have anything?
So Will, I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
One of your earlier slides, when you were kind of giving the overview of Lee, I think the slide showed that the, I don't know if it was average income, but it was a $136,000 number. Was that kind of the, in order to qualify for affordable housing, or?
So the
maybe
way,
repeat that data for me.
of course, yes. So the way New Hampshire, so this was the workforce housing.
Okay.
And so what this is my understanding of the laws are that this is not, you need to make that income to qualify. It's to be considered a workforce housing unit and to count towards the town's count of those workforce housing, which you did, you know, as you discussed, the towns do have an obligation to meet that. The way those are calculated is you're using federal data on the median income, the median household income for a certain number of people. And so for sale units, it's 100% of the median income for a family of 4. And so the more people you have in the household, the higher the median income is. And that is in Lee, $136,000, give or take a little bit of change. And then for rental units, it is 60% of the median income for 3 people, which comes out to 73 and change. So essentially when we're talking about workforce housing, and when you're talking about workforce housing prices, you are talking about what is deemed affordable, so there's that 30% number again, to that income. So that's how I got the actual price when I was able to say, to be a workforce housing unit, the house has to sell for, or be available for less than $407,000, and the rent has to be less than 16, I think was the number.
And so thank you for just refreshing that. And the kind of the comment I wanted to make, I guess first was, those numbers surprised me in the sense that they were higher than I thought they would be, number one. And then just as a further clarification, the formulas that are used to arrive at those numbers are actually in the state statute.
Yes.
In other words, that's not your formula.
No.
It's not the town of Lee's formula. It's actually, the state legislature said, here's the formula everybody uses to determine whether something can qualify as workforce housing, or in the statute, there's actually something called affordable housing and something called workforce housing. So, so there's these different formulas, and that's what Will was using, the statutory formulas.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that very helpful, spoken like a true land use attorney.
It's confusing. I just didn't want people to think that, well, who's making this up? You know,
No, I absolutely appreciate that clarity.
The ground rules were established by the state legislature.
Oh, absolutely, no, I really appreciate that clarity. As someone that does this all the time, sometimes I get a little bit in my head about it and I forget what needs explanations. So I apologize if that was confusing to anyone. But yeah, so does anyone else have anything that surprised them from what we heard today? Yes.
So on one slide, I think you said something about there were older people moving into the community.
Mhm.
That surprised me because I know a lot of people, older people who are moving out of the community because they can't live in their big house anymore and there's nowhere else to live.
Mm.
On that, was
Because
it
of
that
property
older
taxes.
people were moving into the community, or that we're all getting older that still are here? That's what.
Yeah, that is a
I
little
think
bit.
that's part of the children thing too, because all our kids have grown and there's not younger families that are moving in.
No,
which-
that is,
Why we're talking about all this, I guess.
exactly.
So you get the property tax, the property taxes that we pay here in the town of Lee, and we have no kids in the household, which makes it harder for people to either pay them, and then they go down to a fixed income. So how is that
Right.
gonna impact if we get developers coming in here and building units and building any kind of, affordable housing, condominiums, whatever it is that they're planning on doing, or how is that gonna impact our property taxes?
I can't speak to, because there are so many things I don't think that I would be able to give you an answer that would hold up enough that you'd be able to, that I feel comfortable giving you an answer, just because there's so many variables in it. But what I will say is, there's something worth considering as the population is getting older and there isn't, we're already hearing from, and it seems like when I heard a little bit of murmuring in the group when I said this too, there's a demand for more accessible housing for seniors and seniors looking to downsize. And if the community continues aging, that's probably something that needs to be taken into consideration, both as part of this, but also in planning more generally for the town.
The ones that want to stay, right?
I think that question is actually very easily answered, because the goal that you're presenting is to find a way to increase the population of the town without a commensurate increase in the tax base of the town. So what happens? If there's a lower tax base per capita, taxes go up.
Because of our taxes.
Why would it be lower? Why wouldn't it be
For the people
spreading
that-
it out more because they're gonna pay taxes too?
Less
You're
taxes.
looking
Less.
for lower cost housing. Most of the income to the town comes from taxing housing. So if
But they're gonna pay
So you're
some
looking at
taxes.
But it's
$409,000.
But it's not
You
gonna
know,
be the 20,
but
25,000 per
it's not
child.
expenses.
Oh, if there are children involved,
exactly.
yes, but that's not clear. It could
Yeah.
be seniors, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If there's-
It's
If
just,
there's
it's our tax
children in
structure that makes
Right.
it difficult. You know, it's fine when
Yeah.
you're working and you have two people working to pay the taxes, but when you're a senior and you're a widow or a widower trying to stay in town, that
Yeah.
you've been in for 45, 50 years, it's difficult.
Yeah, and right now, the town's zoning is considerably harder to build those types of housing that are more aimed at seniors. They're multifamily, so there's less yard to take care of. They're physically smaller, so you don't have to walk around as much. There aren't as many stairs, stuff like that, so that
Maybe
is.
that's what they should concentrate on.
Yeah,
And the reality is, even if you can sell your house for an exorbitant amount of money, where do you go?
You can't find
can't
another
find
one
that you can afford to
here
buy.
anyway.
It's the same price.
I mean,
It's weird.
That's why they're talking about senior housing, so us, when we get old and we sell
Yeah,
our
that should be the
houses, we could
priority.
actually
Yeah.
get something else that's in
Yeah.
town that's
In
cheaper.
town.
Yeah,
You could, you know,
right.
get buried in the Lee Cemetery there.
Does anyone, this is really great conversation, I'm really glad that people are thinking about this so deeply, but just to keep everyone moving, because, we got time, does anyone have anything else that's responding to this question?
So, did you consider, maybe this isn't that part of that, but seriously, the elephant in all of our taxes is the Oyster River,
District.
school district.
Mhm.
That's like the majority of our our taxes.
It is the
So,
tax.
did you consider that in your review? And that's what's used to draw families in that had kids and so forth, and still does to a certain extent. But they all wanted to be in the Oyster River School District, so then.
So,
But those taxes
I absolutely understand.
Yeah.
The scope that that the state of New Hampshire says is that we could only look at regulations.
Okay.
So we weren't looking at the tax structure. This is and sometimes I find that frustratingly limiting, but we have to look at within the regulatory structures.
But that'll
But
affect
that
it,
would
because
be
the
the
number of kids you said was going down. So actually, that's not as much money into paying into the school district, I guess. I don't know.
No, I appreciate that
You know,
comment. No,
yeah.
I was not taking into consideration school taxes in this.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why
I
we
just think it's
interview
important
more
to
than
talk
8
about the
people.
fact that when you are looking at some of the options that you're offering, it's not the big single-family home that's attractive to the family. It's often this people starting out, the people that are looking, and they're often the people that are getting a lot of the jobs done. It's really great if you have people that live in the town, that work in the town. If they can't afford to live here, then when their town is hiring, they're gonna wanna move there. So it's also the teachers, it's our fire, police departments, and it's the young people that we're missing, the people who don't have kids yet. They can, you know, all these smaller spaces are great for them, so you have kind of that missing piece when we're all focused. I know I live in a really, really big house, and my kids are about to be gone, and I would love to buy a smaller place in life.
No, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. No, that was very helpful. And kind of touching on that, right now, it seems like there's demand in the community for, and I have a question on this, I promise. It seems like there's a demand for more types of housing in the community. And I can't promise you what will or won't be built, but I can tell you that right now, based on the town's ordinances and zoning, what you are encouraging is more of the same. And you aren't encouraging those types of development. So I can't say what the future holds if you change it, but assuming everything stays the same and you don't change your zoning or you don't address any of these issues, things won't change either. So our second question is there anything our interviews did not cover that we should know about Lee and its housing? So this is kind of touching, we know we only spoke to a few people in the developers, so as part of the survey that there's flyers for it up front, and then in addition to that, I want to ask this group, is there anything that our interviews missed that you think we should know about this town? Yes?
I've been interviewing young people, as you referenced, who work close or near the community, who can't afford to live here. Not just is something accessible or available, but they can't afford it. And they're gainfully employed, contributing.
Thank you. And does anyone have anything else? Yes?
Combination of this category and the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
So my family and people around me, we all moved in 3-4 years ago into development.
Mm-hmm.
And what was shocking is what's considered affordable being the $407,000 for a single family home, of which many of those went for higher than that. But if you go look at one town over, same size homes, 2,000 square feet in a community, they're going for $700,000+. You take 8%, I can't afford that anymore. So when I look at it, I've come completely full circle on the topic, initially being somewhat resistant to change, to realizing my older kids will never be able to afford what I have. And then people, my son's 17, in 10 years, he can't buy our house. People's kids who are in their 30s or so, starting out, I did the math before here. You're looking at one of those homes, they get a 30-year mortgage, $6,000 a month. It's completely unaffordable. And so the definition of affordability, there's no builder who's going to build an affordable house in this town. And so therefore, we may need to consider, and again, I was originally resistant to it, but we're not talking about building $100,000 homes. We're talking about trying to get back to $500,000 affordable home here. We're not, instead of $1 million. So I come very
Exactly.
full circle, and so that was the biggest shock to me is 407 here is, we're not, it's,
The salaries
talking
aren't going
about
up as quick as the
cheap,
housing.
we're talking about getting back under $500,000.
A huge difference, yeah. It's just,
I just
Yeah.
ask that because this is being broadcast live and being recorded, if we can try to keep one person at a time speaking, because the people listening actually, it gets all jumbled and they can't hear what we're saying.
So that's what was shocking to me is how high, what affordable housing
No, thank you.
already was.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you were first. I'm so sorry. I'll get everyone, but go ahead.
Is there a ruling in the town, let's say you have this great lovely house that you can't afford,
Mhm.
can you rent out space in your house? Are there rulings against stuff like that, or you can do anything you want with your own home if you own it?
I
You
defer-
can rent.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just, yes, I
Yeah.
guess some areas do have restrictions, so, okay.
One thing that hasn't been addressed, I don't think, is the need for multi-generational housing. And getting back to the question about, I think that you had about the size of the house maybe, or just focusing on individual houses. Some towns say, well, we need to build more houses so we can get more tax money. Well, in 2005, we did a study in Lee for the cost of community services, and found that every house that we build costs us money in services. So we're losing money on every house that we build. That was in 2005. I think it would be very appropriate to do another study, given current numbers,
That's right.
to see if that still holds true.
And it should be our numbers, not numbers from
No, it's within Lee,
within
just
Lee.
within Lee.
Yes.
But not only have housing prices increased, but also the cost of services has increased tremendously. And we don't have sewer, we don't have water, we have police, fire, and schools,
Right.
and highways. And if you look at what the school budget was when we did that survey, I think the budget was about $30 million.
Mhm.
And what is it now? Anybody know?
Maybe about 40. Not more.
The increase in the town budget that year was about, I think it was something like $300,000 total operating budget for the town of Lee. The increase in the school budget was more than that for 1 year. Just that 1 year. More than our whole operating budget. So I think we really need to look at that again.
No, thank you.
So I have a property that has 12 acres, 10 of which is in current use, so it's
Okay.
got 2 acres for the primary home.
Mhm.
But there is a 1,500 square foot outbuilding, a shop in the backyard. I've read the zoning ordinance, and it seems like it's easier for me to convert that to a B&B than it is to make it an apartment or a single-family home.
No.
I'd love for my son to move up with me. It's my backyard.
Thank you. I
We need to
love hearing
talk about
examples like this, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, moving on a little bit, question 3 is, who is not having their housing needs met? It seems like we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to hear a little bit more, please.
Can I go back to the last?
Yes, please, of course.
So Lee is a high-tax town,
Mhm.
okay? People can live here long enough to pay off their mortgage, but their property taxes never go away. So any changes being considered to regulations that would promote housing changes should be evaluated on the, pick it up on Eric's comment, evaluated on the effect it would have on the overall tax rate of those existing homes. We could wind up building and increasing our tax rate, which would not help many people in town.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything on this, or are we clear to move to question 3? Great. So question 3, who is not having their housing needs met in Lee?
Over 55.
Under 30.
Under 30?
Single parents?
Single parents?
Multi-generational.
Generation.
People who work in Lee but live outside of Lee.
Local.
Okay, anyone else? Anything else?
I'm thinking kind of local people who are starting out, just, it seems like some of the houses that are, you know, going for $500,000 or more are being taken by people who come in from out of state. That, so, you know, I don't, it's a conundrum, I don't know how you solve it, but that is it. So it's like those local young people under 30 and local family that,
I think we saw that during COVID. I know my son was looking for houses in the area, and people from out of state came in with cash deals and spending 10, 20, 30,000 above the asking price. And, you know, and he's in his mid-30s, and he said, I just can't compete.
Anyone else?
Was median income 109,000, so anyone under that?
So yes. So that was the 2016 figure, it's 88 in 2021 is the median income in the town.
So anyone under a certain income is out of that.
Wonderful.
People on fixed incomes, and that could be Social Security or Medicaid, Medicare, okay.
Renters. I heard you, thank you.
I was thinking quietly.
No, I did hear from my interviews that there wasn't a lot of options for people that are looking to rent in town. I mean, I can tell you just based on the numbers from 2021, of the 1,800 households in Lee, 250 of them are renters. So that's a very small fraction. Yes?
Only going back to, because if someone tried to create it, I gotta think maybe there's a need, would be homeless vets. I know that was a big thing in town, but obviously if someone was trying to create a spot for homeless vets, maybe it's a underserved population.
Any homeless, I guess.
Controversy.
I'm sorry?
Any homeless, I guess, not, you know, homeless.
Yeah.
but,
No, exactly.
So that's transitional housing, like it would be a transitional housing, it would meet a lot of needs, social needs.
All right. And just in the interest of time, is everyone okay moving on to the next question, or does anyone else have any other groups that we've missed? Yes?
Maybe families whose kids can't move out because they can't afford to go anyplace else would be within that catchment area.
They can't afford a house. Need ADU so I can live in it.
I got one that's kind of the opposite, like, guys, young families that have daycare costs, because they're so high, almost the opposite.
All right. So thank you everyone for that. And our next question is, are there housing types or price points Lee needs more of? So this is feeding off of this one, but you know, what types, are there other housing types that Lee needs? Are there price points that Lee needs? I know we've talked about that a little bit, but what types of housing would you all like to see more of in Lee?
Detached ADUs.
Yeah.
Detached ADUs.
Mm-hmm.
So how would that work?
If from a, do you mean like how detached ADUs generally, or how it would change in the zoning, or how it changed that in the zoning would?
Well, how having an ADU, a detached ADU, how would that work? Here, what is the, idea of how is that gonna work here in Lee?
They just don't touch that.
Is the ADU going to be behind my house, behind my neighbor's house?
That's something that would have to figure, currently you can have an ADU, but it has to be attached.
Attached, yeah.
So if we did detached, we would have to determine and see what would work best and what everybody would want. Would you want it behind? Would you want it, what size would you want it? What do you want it to look like? Do you care what it looks like? All those things would need to be worked out.
Yeah, and how about the well, the septic?
So the well hopefully would be okay, the septic would have to be enlarged in most cases.
And who would pay for that?
Whoever builds it.
Whatever homeowner?
Yeah.
All that is just plans, though, right, for the septic?
No, well, I know, that's a whole different can of worms.
So I think the current ADU square footage is what, 750?
800.
Oh, 800, so I think increasing that, like, that's a barrier, the size of the ADU, so even if it was attached, if it could be 1,000 or 1,200, even if attached, that still might be helpful.
Just because things like laundry, we only have one laundromat in town, so if it's attached, you might be sharing that washer and dryer, but having that space increase to have a washer and dryer, so you have to be able to have that room, just.
Yeah. Yes.
In the past, we've talked about the possibility, and other towns have talked about the possibility of having more than one dwelling per lot. There's no description of what that lot size is, but we have an ordinance in this town that says you can only have one dwelling per lot. So do we need to look at that?
What's considered a lot?
That's why they're connected now, right?
2 acres.
So it's
Just 2 acres.
Well, if it says one
Or-
dwelling per
or-
lot, you could have 100 acres and only have one house on it. That doesn't really,
I know.
from a practical standpoint, make sense.
That's why they're saying you can do a
They
connected,
can get
because
the road
it's
frontage.
one dwelling.
You can get the road frontage issues, you might have 250 feet of road frontage, but 100 acres, so that could be in effect.
The second house could be the ADU.
So,
Right.
so has that ever come up with the planning board, and could you get a variance for something like that?
You can apply for a variance to any zoning ordinance
Or
or
has
building
there ever
regulation.
been a case like that?
Not that I can think of.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything else they want to add? All right.
Multifamily.
I'm sorry?
Multifamily.
Multifamily.
Single story.
For seniors.
Someone say for seniors? I think I heard that.
She said single story.
Yes,
and
okay.
For like seniors, yeah.
Yeah.
So the
Or
multifamily
stair
would be,
lift.
excuse me, I'm sorry. The multifamily would be more than one floor?
I wrote these down as two separate entries. Or at least I interpreted these to mean two different
Because
things.
that's how I interpreted multifamily. You know, coming from the
Yeah.
projects, that's what I think of.
No, yeah, I'm sorry. I just wrote them at the same time, but I meant, I'm reading this as multifamily is one thing that people like to maybe see more of, and then single story is a different thing people like to see more of.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Tiny house community.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Houses. Okay. Anything else? Thank you. This has really been fantastic. Thank you everyone for participating so much. Unless anyone has anything else, I can run ahead to our next. Question 5, and I promise we're hitting the end here. And this one I know might be a little bit interesting, but are there any barriers we've identified today that you think should be addressed, or you just want to learn more about? And do you think there are any that we missed? We've already talked a little bit about the well pits, or the septic pits, I'm
Test
sorry.
pits
Yes.
is what-
Test pits, yes.
I'm not a resident, but one thing I've noticed in looking at Lee is just lack of buildable lands. Is a barrier. Right, if you could add more land.
Yeah, no, that's an absolute, I heard that so many times during the interview process.
I just think you're not that far from build-out with the exception of a few large landowners. And when I say a few, I mean 2 or 3.
No, this makes perfect sense. This also ties back into the point we were making about the large lot sizes in Lee, because the bigger your lot size is, the fewer homes you'll be able to build before you reach build-out. And even if small alterations to that, you might be able to hit more units. And even when Lee does reach build-out, if it reaches build-out and you want to go back and change it, it will be harder to reduce lot sizes because people will have centered their lots in the middle of their 2-acre lots. So you can't just go in and say 1-acre lots from now on. Yes?
Is there a way to use your data and our regulations to use like GIS to calculate out what our build-out point is of like, given our current regulations, what the maximum amount of build-out would be under current regulations? Because that would affect like our service costs and things like that. If we knew if you have all these land maps, you have these parcel data, and you're able to accumulate that with our regulations and go, okay, in these scenarios, these are potential, if these are developed as, be obviously like there's some variables as far as like what the overall use would be, but you could do different, almost like examples of like, different models, if you will, of like depending on if this chunk of 100 acres was developed as this form, it obviously different than if this was all single families, and you look at your wetland setbacks, all these things, and do a calculation on like what our build out would be for the future, and then because that would obviously show us, it would obviously show us like where we're at, and as change goes, how it change our build out versus how we're currently regulated.
Would Stratford County Commission have that information? It seems like when I've been there for planning strategic plans.
Stratford County Regional Planning did a build-out for the town a number of years ago, I don't remember.
10 years ago.
At least 10. And perhaps that could be updated, but it's something that, that's
A lot of
the thing.
our maps and our regulations, things have changed, like as far as soils and all these, all these things have been updated, so.
Yeah, I can't build a methodology for it in my head right now, but I can look into it, and if it sounds like maybe that might be something.
It seems like a big concern everyone has is build out and like what our current, down this current path where you talk about, oh, we're almost there, but okay, what is almost there? If these large landowners decide to do X, Y, Z, what could it do?
Yeah.
But then you also have to consider the conservation land. And I think also maintaining our agricultural community is important to a lot of people in this town.
Of course. No, and I usually say this up front, please forgive me, but we are not, the purpose of this study is not to change the character or what Lee is. And this is something that I tried to keep in mind when I was doing this audit. I know that Lee is not Durham. I know that Lee is not Portsmouth. I know that Lee is not Manchester. And the purpose of this audit is not to turn you into something that you are not, but it is to present you with options that maybe could help make Lee somewhere that your children can continue to live in, and where you have more options to when you want to change houses, there are options for you.
So maybe we could partner with some more sophisticated engineering about like living closer to wetlands without destroying the environment, maybe a sophisticated culvert system or something, so that we could live with it instead of, having to stay so far away from it. Because there's streams that trickle through almost everybody's property, right? And you just can't go too far. But you can protect them.
Thank you. Yes.
I guess I would ask the question of what's wrong with approaching build-out, given the fact that we also have to take into account our master plan. And do we want to radically change our master plan for the sake of building more houses? So that's a philosophical question I think everybody needs to answer, but we've had a string of master plans that have had a common thread for the last 25 or 30 years now. And do we want to radically change that? Part of that was protecting 25% of the land buildable uplands from development. So that's a major philosophical change. Is that a barrier?
I don't think that's up for that particular one, because that's not regulatory. I think that's up for the town to decide. I don't think I can answer that for you. I think it's, ultimately, the town is responsible for what you want Lee to be in the future. And I'm happy to provide recommendations and point out to you things that I've seen, but I think that the trajectory of the town is ultimately up to you all and the greater voting population.
Yeah, and I think, speaking to the housing committee, that's something we have discussed at the housing committee. Most communities like Lee in New Hampshire have spent the last 30 years preaching conservation and limiting building and preserving rural character, and it's tough to slam the brakes on in 24 months and say, oh my goodness, we need housing now, when you've convinced the population over the last 3 decades that conservation is the way you want to proceed.
I think this is talking a little bit differently. It's about the same land and how we use it, I guess.
Right.
The buildable land, not taking away conservation, not
Yeah.
taking away the preserved areas.
No, absolutely, and I mean, permanently preserved land is exactly that. You can't touch it. And so, it is, especially if the town wants to maintain high levels or even continue producing more open space, it's important to think about how you use the land that's left. I think in the order of people, yes.
I think one thing that we've missed is making definitions of things consistent. So we have a 3-unit apartment, and we are categorized in the same grouping as a huge apartment complex. We need 20 acres, and there's no way we can do anything without 20 acres, so.
Because you're considered multifamily.
Mm-hmm.
3 acres is multifamily. I mean, 3 units is
3
multifamily.
units,
Yeah. Yes.
Is there any timeline projected for anything that might happen?
So the grant, I'm here until July of next year. I can't make any decisions for the planning board or the town after that.
But timeline is an issue for people looking at different type of housing. Not saying you have to do it, but.
Yeah, I will say the way we wrote this audit and the intent of the recommendations that we will provide based on, our review and also some of the feedback we're getting from this in the survey is intended to be a kind of longer term document, that we would encourage the town to, tackle 1 or 2 things every year going forward, bring, a couple things to town meeting maybe, address what they can when they want. So I know especially the audit, it looks very daunting at first. Even if you want to address 1/8 of the things that we talked about right now, that's considerable work, and I don't want anyone to be discouraged by thinking that you need to tackle everything all at once. Any improvement is good improvement, or any work is good work, is my philosophy on that.
So I can just add a little bit more to that. So from a timing point of view, we're really at the beginning of the process.
Okay.
And to make any changes to our zoning, any proposals would need to go to town meeting. And then what you have to do is back up from the town meeting date, because there's required public hearings and other process that needs to follow. So we've, pretty much determined as a housing committee and planning board that there's not enough time between now and the 2024 town meeting to actually present a proposal at that town meeting. So I can't speak definitively because it's not my decision, but it seems very unlikely that we would have anything to present to the town in 2024. It's more likely 2025.
So any of the reviews or any of your recommendations, is that going to be made public?
Yes. Yes, right now it's in draft, and so that's been distributed to the housing committee and the planning board. But then once we get finalized, just to make sure that I haven't made any mistakes in it, it will be released to the public.
And how about this information that we're getting, the presentation that you had?
I would be happy to share with it and I mean, it's being shared on YouTube right now, I believe.
It's all public information and
Yeah.
a copy can be provided.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Getting back to the master plan, one thing we haven't talked about is the whole big picture of housing and how that affects the infrastructure. And what other possibilities are there? Any towns that you know of or anybody else that knows of that have really sat down and developed a big picture of the future of the town as far as housing needs? Does that mean we have to build sewage treatment plants, and do we have to put in town wells? Durham owns a lot of land in Lee that they have a town well on. So are we limiting ourselves by, from that standpoint, about the infrastructure part of the whole picture? We can build more houses, but can we really support those houses? And so what are the possibilities of doing a study like that? Does anybody know? Somebody's got to pay for it.
That's fair. No,
Dover did it.
Dover did it?
Dover's doing it, yeah.
Eric, what I can offer, at least in partial response, is that our current master plan does not have a section on housing. So under state law, there are certain minimum requirements or a list of topics that you have to require in a master plan. We cover those, but housing is not among the mandatory sections. So one of the things that we'll want to do as we move through this process is to look at our master plan, write a section on housing so that whatever we do from a zoning point of view is supported by the master plan. So that will be part of it. It's not within Will and his group's purview, but that's something the town will have to do as part of this process.
Thank you.
The other thing I didn't put in there was traffic.
Roads.
You know, how's that gonna affect housing, or how does housing affect traffic flow and traffic patterns? Right up the street up here is a perfect example. Since development took place in Epping with Walmart and Lowe's, traffic has exponentially increased on 155. And do you really want to build a house on 155? I've been past 17 times making a left-hand turn into my driveway.
No, these are absolutely things that need to be taken into consideration. And, you know, I think that ultimately I'm somewhat bound by the regulatory nature of what I'm supposed to look at, but I really do think that, you know, if the town wants to see more density, those are things that need to be looked at.
But is that part of the master plan? Would that come into play with the master plan? I'm sorry to prolong this, but I guess my question is, are those things something the planning board would consider in developing a master plan? The whole infrastructure part of it?
So I'm not certain about that, Eric. What I can tell you is that in the context of any multifamily development or even a subdivision, so today in Lee, without making any changes under ordinance, a developer, if they have proper land, can come in and put in a 20 house, a 30 house, a 40 house subdivision, right? They have that right to do that. They have to go through the subdivision process. And as part of that process in front of the planning board, if it appeared that there was going to be a substantial impact on traffic, we would ask for a traffic study. And in fact, we have done that with different projects, whether they be commercial or residential. So that's built into the subdivision review process and site plan review process. Site plan covers commercial and multifamily, so that's already there. I'm not an expert on master plans, but my sense is that it's probably less of a master plan and more of a site plan review and subdivision review.
Well, I guess as an example, Mark, if we looked at multifamily housing, for instance, we have a height restriction in this town. Well, the height restriction is there because we don't want to pay $1 million something for a new ladder truck. So that's part of the infrastructure. And that's going to dictate the types of structures that you build. So I really think we need to look at the whole picture at some point instead of just
Yeah,
one
and
little
perhaps
thing at a
that's
time.
part of it. I just sharing with you what I know.
No, and tying into looking at the master plan, I will say if the town decided to in its next master plan update, there could be recommendations that called for looking at those types of surveys on a basis. And that could, it sounds like it might not necessarily fit in the housing section exactly based on what you're hearing, but there could definitely be in different sections of the master plan, something that addressed that. I have one more question if people are ready to move on, and then everyone gets to go home after this, and you don't have to see me again. Or we can, or if anyone else has anything else they want to add here. Perfect then. What would Lee look like at its housing best? And I know.
The way it is.
No, and the way it is could absolutely, if that's what people feel. All I wanna know is 20, 30, 40 years from now, what would you think Lee would look like at its best? It's resolved any problems it's had, it's working better for you or people you know, or anything. What does that look like? Does it look different? Does it look the same? How does it look different if it does look different?
More money for our town buildings, but it seems to get absorbed by the schools.
The town center, you want it to
Yeah.
be cleaned up a little bit, yeah. It's a cute area.
And it always gets voted down because
Our own town
you can only have
office.
so much money.
Yes?
More walkable and bikeable.
Mm. And so would that mean maybe some housing types that are kind of closer together, maybe in a kind of denser formation with access to commercial and other opportunities, you can bike to your house, to the store, something like that? Okay.
I'd like to see some sidewalks, not everywhere, but just some places where people like to walk a lot on the street, you know, where people, cars can't see you.
I could argue with, I just gotta bring up this point of, we talk about those kind of things, but the side cost would be, okay, now you get a cost of employee to clear those
I'm
sidewalks,
just
sidewalk
saying,
machine, just,
my utopia.
you're going to
would
cost.
have some sidewalks.
This is the buildings and ground side of things, that I think.
Anything else? Yes?
Bring back a downtown convenience store, that'd be a nice little country store.
Like they used to be.
Yeah, it used to be, like I did stuff, kind of candies, a kid at church. and-
2 chicks.
Oh, 2 Chicks is, I'm talking the true, like, country store it was when I was a kid.
The Wellingtons before that.
Yes?
A
We've had some-
wide variety of housing, of commercial, of people.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have anything else? Any other housing types you'd like to see in town? Any other places you'd like to see more housing in town? Anything like that? Or if people think that stuff just wants to stay the same, I will absolutely write that. Yes?
Right, that
Sure.
stay the same. Barriers were put there for a reason.
Thank you.
I think allowing ADUs actually on your personal property is something that should be discussed. Either for family members or people having their parents come live with them or whatever. I think it needs to be, I think we need to talk about it because, huh?
Talking detached, because.
Detached.
Okay, you just.
Detached, so, yeah.
Yeah.
We can do attached now.
And now, that's what I just.
And if we have to look at all the, whatever we need, the regulations with septic and all that, then that's fine. Just being able to allow it.
Thank you, yes.
The country's going crazy on small houses.
Like that, a mini house on your property.
And just for me, when you say, do you mean like specifically tiny houses or just like single-family houses, just small?
Those tiny houses that.
Okay. No, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I got what you were saying right. Anything else?
Well.
I got one over here.
Yes.
Mixed use.
Mixed use. Thank you. Sorry, my boards are talking.
Mixed use.
Commercial and residential in the same building.
And I will say, there's same structure mixed use. And sometimes and that's kind of referred to as vertical mixed use. So, you've got, that's what you think of usually when you think of, you got a store on one floor and then you got a house above it. But sometimes some towns are doing what's called horizontal mixed use, which is just you have a lot and you have a house next to a small store on the same property, stuff like that.
Do we allow that now, Karen, or is that a variance?
No.
Don't we have, or we did, like, just that one that the electrician's in now or whatever? Wasn't that? And that was 2 chicks
Variance.
below. And, oh, it was a variance again, okay.
Anything else? All right, well, that is the end of my questions then. And I want to thank you all so much. This has been really great. I've really enjoyed coming up here. I've really enjoyed everyone taking the time to speak. And thank you very much. And just also, as I mentioned earlier, we have a survey that the town is hosting. This is a QR code for it. There are some flyers up front. And I understand the town's going to also post some other ways to get access to it, so you can click on it from a computer.
It's on the website, it's in the e-crier, and it's on Facebook.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Has Durham and Madbury done any of this?
I don't remember off the top of my head. There are several dozen towns that are doing work like this, but I'm not working on either of them, so I'm not sure what their programs are.
Is this information on the website?
Thank you.
Just want to thank everybody, on behalf of the planning board, everybody for coming tonight. This was a great turnout, and please continue to keep coming, because there'll be more public hearings as this process rolls along. So really appreciate your willingness to come out. I know it's hard after a long day, so thank you very much.
The presentation,
Yeah,
it isn't, but I think we could post it.
like this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share the slides.
He'll share it to me,
Just
we'll
all
post
this.
it on the website, town website.
Yeah, no problem. I can do that right after the meeting.
You can get that to us, Wes. We can put it on Facebook and the town website.
Absolutely no problem.
All right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.